Okay, boys, we're in quite a boring period, right? We've got the international break, so there's not too much to cover. So I thought, when's a better time than to go through and let's rate and rank every Chelsea legend, in the sort of last 40, 50 years, right? And some of these go a bit further than that. But, I thought, right, there's 40 names here. Let's go through and let's see where everyone ranks. Just a bit of fun. There's nothing else to really go through. So let's get straight into it, right? So David Luiz, I'm gonna put him in B tier. Was pivotal when we won the Champions League, often playing through an injury as well. He did win everything with us as well, Premier League, FA Cups, made over 200 appearances, and, was quite an exciting defender. Some of the free kicks he would take and his shot power, but he was a sort of ahead of the game, really, wasn't he? A modern ball playing defender before that was really a thing, and before teams were all about playing out from the back, going short. Back then, we'd be going long, trying to contest balls that way, right? I think if he was coming through the ranks now, he'd be one of the most sought after defenders in Europe. Absolutely, he just had sort of every attribute that a modern defender needs and requires now. So didn't have the longest longevity with us at Chelsea, right? It's not like he played with us for 10, 15 years, and he could probably get higher up the list. But, if he was a player now and he stayed with Chelsea, he could have easily been in that sort of 80 or who knows, maybe higher, right? But, great player. I enjoyed watching him. So B tier for me. Okay, Di Matteo. I'm going to put him in C tier. Now, you could maybe put him in D tier. Maybe I'm being a bit biased. I'm trying to rank them as players, right? Not just, some players here have been player managers. So I don't want to be too biased in that, but I can't help it when he was the interim manager when we won our first Champions League, right? So I'm going to be a bit biased in that respect. But to be honest, he was somewhat underrated as a player as well. Quite tidy in midfield. Won 2 FA Cups with us, Super Cup as well, and then obviously won the Champions League as the interim manager. So I'm going to put him in C. He was actually quite, tidy on the ball, but, certainly not one of the big Chelsea legends. Okay, Peter Osgood, he does have to go in S tier. Maybe, you could put him in A tier because obviously players get better as the years go on, right? What GSP said in MMA, right? Athletes of today are always getting better than the athletes of the past. And yes, that is true to an extent, but I think he's known as the king of Stamford Bridge for a reason. There's a statue of him outside, and he was iconic in the 1970s. And I think Chelsea probably aren't Chelsea as we know it today without him. So for me, he does have to go in S tier. And I'm not going to sit here and say I've watched loads of Peter Osgood. I'm not quite old enough, but you can watch the clips, but you can also appreciate the history for what it is. And he was a key figure in Chelsea becoming Chelsea, right? So he does have to go in S tier for me. Obviously, we've got Michael Essien up next. Player I really liked, someone who really it resonates in my head when I'm thinking of back when I was a boy and I was watching Chelsea, right? And I was really getting into supporting the team. Michael Essien was for sure one of those players, right? Over 250 appearances for us. Scored some iconic goals. Those volleys from outside of the box. Some absolute stunners. Really important in our Champions League runs as well. And he was just a powerhouse in midfield. Mourinho definitely got the best out of him. Complemented Lampard so well if we were playing in a pivot or 4-3-3. And everyone knows he was a great player for Chelsea, right? So someone I'm a big fan of as well. John Terry has to go ahead of Peter Osgood for me. Absolutely warrants S tier. I don't think anyone's going to make an argument that John Terry does not make S tier, right? Over 700 apps, almost the most appearances for Chelsea, right? He's the leader, he's the captain, absolute rock at the back. Played, he could play in so many different teams. If you look, he was the central figure in defence with Jose Mourinho when we had an absolute fortress back in 2004-05 season, right? But he was also pivotal when we had Conte in 2014 and the seasons going forward as well, right? So look, he could play in any system. He was that good. Scored over 60 goals as well. Always chipping in with important headers. Great finisher. And he also has the most Premier League clean sheets as captain. So no one's going to say he's not S tier. He absolutely is S tier. And the trophies he's won throughout his career, he's won everything, right? Ricardo Carvalho, I'm going to put him just below Essien. When it's quite fitting, him and Terry are back to back. That partnership was one of the best defensive, centre back duos we've seen in Premier League history. You have to say, it was those two and Cech who got the record for 15 goals conceded in a whole season, right? Which is crazy. We might not see that broken, anytime soon. And he was part of, the team that made Stamford Bridge the fortress that it was, especially under Jose Mourinho. Teams would come here, they were absolutely scared. They knew they weren't going to score, and we would play them off the pitch as well. So, definitely, a very good Chelsea legend, and complemented Terry really well. So, next up, Makelele. Where do I want to put Makelele? I think, is he ahead of Carvalho? Maybe I'm going to put him just below Carvalho. They could switch maybe. But, revolutionised his position, that they coined the position, the Makelele position. He sort of brought to terms, a new style of play in that DM position. Obviously, Mourinho got, the best out of him as well. Over 200 appearances for us, helped us with all our defensive records we kept as well. Absolutely a Chelsea legend, and we've had some great midfielders in the last 20 years, and he's certainly one of the best ones. So for me, definitely goes in A tier. Now, I'm going to put Thiago Silva. I might put him ahead of David Luiz, Maybe I'm being a bit biased because Thiago Silva is probably one of my favourite players we've had at Chelsea, especially in recent years. Considering how we're structured right now, right? And it's our sole focus to go out and sign all these youngsters and poach talent from different academies, etc. One of the best signings we've made in the last couple of years has been Thiago Silva. And when we got him, people call him an old man. Coming from being at PSG for so long, came into Chelsea and just hit the ground running, right? Just such a class act. I think every Chelsea fan is, adores the player, to be fair. Such a good leader. I wish we kept him for a few more years. He can play at that top level for so long. We've got his son in the academy now as well. But look, he's a fan favourite, won the Champions League with us as well. Tuchel, they had a really good connection there. And he's just a class act, right? So I'm going to put him in B. It's a shame. I think, he spent so much of his career at Paris Saint-Germain. If he, let's say, spent the last 10 years in the Prem or with Chelsea or whatever it may be, people would be giving him a lot more, of his flowers, right? Because he absolutely is one of the best defenders of our generation, 100%. And I think if he was playing in the Premier League, people would be, giving him his praise a lot more than they do, just because not everyone is watching PSG week in, week out. But if you do, you know how good of a defender he was. But because people weren't watching that, and then when he came to Chelsea, we're like, oh, Thiago Silva's really good. It's like, yes, he is really good, right? And he's absolutely up there with, Sergio Ramos and the defenders of that generation. It's just a shame, due to the nature of people not watching maybe every AC Milan game or every PSG game. When he came to the Prem, people actually started to appreciate him. But obviously he was only with us for a couple of years. But he could have easily been A and S tier. He's just that good, right? If he stayed with us longer. Aspi, I am going to put Aspi at I'm going to put him ahead of Essien, to be fair. I think he's top of A. If some people want to make the argument that he goes in S tier, look, I can hear it. Over 500 appearances, played so many games for us. Again, Mr. Consistent, Mr. Versatile, was our captain as well. Played anywhere across the back four, even back five, right? Could play left back, right back, centre back in a back three, or, in a two-man partnership. That he could play anywhere. I think towards the end of his career, though, he did, he lost a lot of his physical attributes and he lost a lot of his pace. So it was quite hard when he was playing right back. He was, being tormented a little bit, so we did sort of fall off a little bit in that respect, similar to Ivanovic. But we're talking peak and in his prime. He's absolutely one of the best in Premier League history for sure, and he's quite underrated in that respect. And look, he captained us to a Champions League. So if people want to put him S tier, I can hear it. But for me, I'm going to put him top of A. I think when you see the names who are in S tier, they just sort of edge ahead of him. Okay, right. So Gary Cahill, I'm going to put him in D tier. Look, over 250 appearances for Chelsea, right? Played loads of games for us, but he was only really a squad player, and then he sort of had his injury problems as well. But look, he was a professional individual. He did his job when he was called upon, and I think most Chelsea fans would agree, came in sort of like almost like how Chalobah is now, maybe he was kicked out of the team at some points, but when he comes in, he does a job, he looks okay, and he's just a squad player, wasn't really, on the level of Carvalho and John Terry or Thiago Silva, any of those sort of defenders. But look, I think I liked him. He was a professional individual, right? Desai, ooh, I'm gonna put Desai just below Essien. I think Essien and Aspi edge it for me, but Desai is definitely A tier for me. Rock solid, captained Chelsea as well. Was sort of one of these pivotal signings we made that made Chelsea into the sort of global super club that we are now, right? Came in before we were really challenging for the major titles and everything. Pivotal in sort of Chelsea's early dominance in that respect. And again, he captained the team, rock solid at the back with Le Bleu as well, right? So for me, definitely A tier. Okay, up next, Charlie Cook. I'm going to put him sort of bottom of B. He's definitely a Chelsea legend. One of these Scottish wingers. Scotland had I don't know what's happened to the Scotland national team and the players they produced, right? Sort of back in the 70s, they were in the 80s. They were really producing some great players. I'm not too sure what's happened to Scottish football. You could say the same for Wales now. They had a good generation maybe 10 years ago, but now there's not many good Welsh youngsters coming through, right? England sort of dominating everything in the UK. But, great Scottish winger, over 300 appearances for us, and he won the FA Cup, back in the day as well. So he was an important player for us. Again, I'm not going to sit here and say I've watched loads of games of him, right? I wasn't watching football 50 years ago, but when you sort of look through Chelsea's history and the names that do keep popping up, Charlie Cook's always there. He definitely warrants a sort of B position. Petr Cech, he definitely has to go. I mean, it's obviously an S tier, right? No one's going to argue against that. And I think you can kind of you'll guess the names that are going into S tier, right? It's quite obvious who the absolute Chelsea legends are, right? And Cech is up there. Arguably one of the greatest goalkeepers in Premier League history. If people want to say Schmeichel's ahead of him, I can hear that. For me, he's ahead of Van der Sar, ahead of other goalkeepers. He's absolutely up there, though, sort of top 2, top 3 for me. And yes, you can make arguments for each. It's going to come down to preference as well. But I think if he doesn't get that injury and he has to wear the cap, his peak before he got that was, absurd. And obviously he was a great goalkeeper after the injury, but you could tell, his sort of bravery diminished a little bit, which is understandable. He had a really serious injury, but regardless of that, one of the best goalkeepers in Premier League history, easily, got the record clean sheets for Chelsea as well. And some of the performances he was putting in the big games is absolutely ridiculous. If you watch our first Champions League win, for every single penalty, he goes the right way. He was just locked in. And that game, saved multiple penalties. He was a keeper for the big games. Something we do miss now, for sure. It'd be nice to have a Petr Cech regen coming through the club, right? But yeah, absolutely S tier. I don't think anyone's going to be arguing against that. Okay, Ivanovic. I'm going to put Ivanovic maybe ahead of David Luiz. Ivanovic, when he was in his prime, was just a physical beast, right? Just marauding down that right flank, from corners, so deadly. Obviously, you got that iconic header for us to win the Europa League, right? Look, but his fall off, again, it was so drastic. He was so good and such a good physical specimen, but you could tell, when players really rely on their speed and their strength, once that sort of starts to diminish and maybe they're not the best technically, you definitely saw that, and it was the case with Ivanovic, right? His fall off was crazy. He went from being outstanding to then just, really subpar, but pivotal in some, major trophies that we won, over 350 appearances as well. I just think, if he kept that same consistency, he could have easily been in the sort of A tier with these names, but I think B tier, it looks all right for him. Okay, Arjen Robben. I'm going to put him So I'm going to put him ahead of Di Matteo. Obviously his prime wasn't at Chelsea. We know that he went to Bayern Munich and became an absolute, legend there. But you could see the early impact he had at Chelsea. Just we know what Arjen Robben does, right? On the right wing, cuts inside on his left foot. You know what he's going to do, but no one could really stop him. He was injury prone though, so we didn't quite see the best of him at Chelsea, and he was young. If he stayed at Chelsea, he'd definitely be an S tier if he stayed for 10, 15 years, right? Because that's how good of a talent and player he was. But still, over 100 appearances with us. Won 2 Premier League titles in the 3 years he was here as well, right? But didn't quite have the same impact as some of the other players. But I always liked Arjen Robben as a player. I thought, just class player, to be honest. Ruud Gullit. Where are we going to put Ruud Gullit? I think he is a Chelsea legend, but I don't know. Is he ahead of these players for me? Not quite. So, yeah, I think sort of middle of B tier was great. Obviously, he had his impact. Again, he's another one of these player managers that we've got on the list, right? He's a statement signing back in the day. Again, sort of similar to like Desailly. He came to the club before Chelsea were known as Chelsea, right? And we weren't this mainstay team in London and dominating for Premier Leagues and, challenging for the Champions League and on and all of that, right? So, another one of these players who helped Chelsea grow. Huge reputation when he came in, and then also as manager, he did win the FA Cup, which was a big deal at the time. So I think it warrants B tier. Look, we didn't get him in his prime. Obviously, he would have easily been like S tier when he was winning Ballon d'Ors, but a great player. Okay, up next, Jimmy Greaves. Jimmy Greaves is sort of more of a Tottenham legend, right? But I think sort of B tier again, sort of low B tier makes sense as well. Great goal scoring record. Definitely more of a Spurs legend, but he's still up there in Chelsea. Came through the academy as well, right? But he's an iconic player from that period. So prolific. And I think B tier is quite fair for him, right? Okay, Ashley Cole. I think Ashley Cole does have to go. Where are we going to put him? Ahead of Essien for me? Yeah. Is he ahead of Aspi? Maybe not. I think maybe Aspi, just because of the amount of appearances and his leadership, right, just edges it for me. So I think Ashley Cole, top of A tier, definitely does make sense. He was a world-class left-back. Defensively so good as well. People will remember, especially me as a kid watching, and he'd lock up Ronaldo when Ronaldo was at Manchester United, right? And I think, Messi was saying he was one of the toughest defenders he'd gone against. So in his prime, Ashley Cole was ridiculous, right? Won everything with us and just sort of locked down that left back position. So for me, obviously, top of A tier. Willian. I'm going to put Willian D tier. It sounds harsh because I do quite like Willian as a player. I think towards the end of his Chelsea stay, people did get quite frustrated with him, right? But I'm going to put him in D tier. And look, being D tier is not bad. These are some of the the greatest players who've played for Chelsea, right, and got the best reputation. But I just think he was quite inconsistent at times, but helped us win 2 Premier League titles, over 300 appearances, chipped in with goals and assists, some good free kicks as well. But I think towards the end of his time at Chelsea, I remember people getting quite annoyed with him and how inconsistent he was. So I'm going to drop him down to D. If people want to say C, though, I can hear it. Okay, Joel Cole. Joel Cole was a great player. I'm going to put him ahead of Ivanovic. Yeah, I think so. I think I like that. For me, Thiago Silva is like bordering on A tier. I'm quite biased because I love Thiago Silva so much. So I think Joe Cole, top of B tier, is a good position for him. Technically brilliant. He's the sort of player now who would absolutely thrive in the modern game. Just so good on the ball. Sort of, with that sort of stature, similar to like Phil Foden in a way. With the great first touches and just how good he was on the ball. But over 200 appearances for us. It's not like he was at Chelsea his whole career, right? So I think putting him at B is fair. But won multiple Premier Leagues with us, scored some beauties for goals. Yeah, great player. I enjoyed watching Joe Cole. Right, Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank. Where are we going to put him? think I'm going to put him top of C. I think he's ahead of Robin, right? You know, his first season was electric. He came straight to Chelsea, won the Golden Boot. And if you look at his goals and assists in his first, like 100 games, it's really high. He absolutely hit the ground running, was really good. But I think longevity sort of knocks him down. If he kept that up for a couple more seasons, right, he could have easily climbed up here. But I think, yes, he was electrifying in those first couple seasons, but he didn't keep that up his whole career. But, he's a great striker, don't get me wrong. Okay. Gudjon's son, I think he's the first Icelandic player in the Premier League, I want to say. So, where are we going to put him? He was a great player, someone I always sort of remember from, Chelsea back in the day. I'm going to put him in C tier, though. Scored plenty of goals for us, over 70, like 78 goals for Chelsea, right? Very versatile player, could play anywhere, really. It's a player, Mourinho really liked as well. Helped us win, Premier Leagues. So I'm going to put him in C. He's not one of the top Chelsea legends, right? But I think he was a great player and helped us in that sort of transition period under Abramovich when we really became a household name, right? Okay. Ray Wilkins, this guy's an absolutely a Chelsea legend, right? I think I'm going to put him below Desailly, but sort of, middle A tier, I think is fair for him, right? Youngest captain at Chelsea at 18, so he captained the club at 18, right? Again, he was one of these players who helped us with promotion after we got relegated and we were in some financial difficulty, right? So, when you put that into perspective, he absolutely, warrants a place up in the A section, right? Elegant player as well, but, captained the club at such a young age and he helped us get promoted. He was loyal, he stayed with us. Many players could have jumped ship, but no, he stayed with us. So, for that reason, he does get A tier for me. Okay, Drogba. Drogba up next. I mean, come on. There's only one place Drogba can go, right? He's in S tier, of course he is. Player for the big moments. Was he the most prolific? Did he score a goal every game or no? What was it? But, his record in finals speaks for itself. 10 goals in 10 finals. 164 goals in 380 games. So, could he have, hit higher numbers? Absolutely. But, if you're thinking about, how he played as well, he was quite, unselfish in that regards, playing back to goal, really getting others involved in play as well. But look, Mr. Wembley, scored arguably the greatest header goal of all time. Just won us our Champions League. And was it the best performance? No, we gave away a penalty, but it just shows, everything on the line. One of the last kicks of the game, corner, near post flick on header. It was just cinema, right? So no Chelsea fan is not putting Drogba S tier. He's universally loved. And look, if it was a final, you could bet on Drogba to score. That's just the player he was. So of course he's in S tier. Zola. Oh, this is tough, isn't it? I'm going to put him just below Aspi. I think top of A tier. Again, he's one of these players. If people want to put him in S tier, I can hear it. Absolutely, he's a player of that caliber. Italian magician. He made people fall in love with the game, right? It's the kind of player you'd pay money to go and watch in person, right? Just so good on the ball. Flair, dribbling, just his technical ability was just outstanding, right? Again, if he was a player in the modern game now, every club would be looking at him. Just so good on the ball. And again, he's another one of these players that helped Chelsea, elevate, won an FA Cup with us as well, and helped us become the club we are. So, look, maybe, people who are a bit older might put Zola in S tier. I definitely watched him, but, it's not sort of like, for me, the players that really resonate with me would be like Hazard and Lampard and players like this, right? So from the older generation, if they want to put Zola in S tier, I absolutely hear it. But I think top of A tier for me is quite fair. I think Shevchenko has to be, bottom of D, really, right? Big reputation, our record signing, he was coming in, he just won the Ballon d'Or, right? So you're thinking, right, we're getting a really great striker here. And it just didn't work, right? Plagued by injuries, wasn't the most consistent, and it was just a big flop signing, one of these big players we brought in, big reputation, and it didn't work. You know, yes, he was plagued by injuries, so he was unlucky in that respect. You know, again, it just didn't work for the reputation, the Ballon d'Or winner, the player we're bringing in, right? He, he failed, right? So, bottom of D tier, but I thought it was worth mentioning because he was our record signing as well, right? So, Dennis Wise, ooh, I think I'll put him like top of B tier. You know, again, some of the old heads might want to put him higher, but I think, you know, like he's an iconic Chelsea captain. You know, I think there's a story of him, you know, biting a cab driver back in the day. You know, a wild guy. You know, you can kind of see it in the picture there. Sort of, you know, one of these like Gattuso, you know, really aggressive workhorse midfielders. You know, obviously captained our club back in the day. Over 400 appearances for Chelsea as well, so he really racked up those appearances. You know, part of that sort of 90s revival that made Chelsea, you know, what they were in the early 2000s with Abramovich and Jose Mourinho. So he helped the club in that way, right? And obviously important for FA Cup wins as well. So I think top of B tier is fair for me. Now, N'Golo Kante, I am going to put him in S tier. He kind of borders on S and A for me, but I think, you know, maybe 10, 20 years from now, when I'm looking back and I'm thinking of some of the best players that have played for Chelsea, N'Golo Kante is going to be in that list for me. And I think we're not going to have this sort of, you know, people can be tend to more biased to players from a previous generation, right? Because you sort of get that, you know, you don't get as much nuance, especially, you know, watching them game in, game out. But when they've retired and it's 20 years from now, you can kind of reflect on it a bit more and say, you know what, that guy he was amazing, right? And I think it's going to be the case with Kante. So I'm going to put him in S tier. If people want to put him in A tier, I can hear it as well. But, you know, look, did he get the most appearances for us? No, you know, about 250 odd. So look, he's not one of these players who played 500-600 games for us, but I don't think that matters. You know, Mr. Consistent. You know, we could have, you'd have to say with him and Hazard, we could have really strengthened our team a lot more than we did. We kind of let these players down a lot. We could have easily won more Premier League titles, you have to say. But, you know, saying he was pivotal in our Champions League win is not doing it justice. You know, this guy won 3 back-to-back man of the matches. You know, 2 man of the matches against Real Madrid. Who's doing that, especially from midfield, right? And then in the final against Man City, absolutely bullied that midfield. And we don't win the Champions League without him. So for me, you know, he has to go in S tier. And, you know, that's a game I was watching live in person as well. You know, probably one of the most nervous I've ever been in my life watching that game. You know, yes, I can remember us winning in 2012, but again, I was 12, so it doesn't quite resonate with me the same. I was a man when I was watching us win the second Champions League, and Kante was a part of that, and everyone was giving him his plaudits. And, you know, yes, he got plagued by injuries quite a bit towards the end of his Chelsea career, and that's why he went to Saudi. But he's absolutely, you know, universally loved among Chelsea fans. And look, we don't win that Champions League without him. So I'm putting him in S tier. Yes, other people can maybe put him in A tier, but for me, he was that good, right? Okay, Ramirez, a bit of a cult hero sort of player. I'm going to put him in D tier though. You know, he was quite inconsistent, brilliant at times. You know, obviously that iconic chip at the Camp Nou, but I just don't think. Yeah, I just don't think he was quite consistent enough. You know, got a few injuries as well, but a good squad player. Uh, and yes, a cult hero. You know, he was great, but he was nothing really more than a squad player, to be honest. So I'm going to put him in D tier, but he was great. He was great. Okay, up next, Bobby Tamling. Where are we going to put him? I think maybe just ahead of Ruud Huller. I don't quite rate him as high as some of the old, you know, other older generation players, but he was the all-time top scorer before Lampard, right? He's still the second all-time top goal scorer for us. Iconic 60s player, you know, maybe ask your dads or if anyone older's watching, you know, they are going to rate him. He was a great striker back in the day as well. You know, one of these who was super prolific, almost averaging, you know, a goal a game back in the day. But, you know, I am going to knock him down a little bit because, you know, just due to the nature of how the game was played back then, you know, I just think he gets knocked down a bit, and we weren't winning loads of trophies, but he's absolutely a Chelsea legend, right? Okay, Ron Harris. Yeah, this is a tricky one, isn't it? I'm going to put him below Zola. Yeah, I think that's a good position for him, though. You know, club record, 795 appearances, so, you know, more appearances than John Terry, still holds that record as well. I don't think anyone's going to come close to breaking that anytime soon. Maybe Palmer, but I doubt it, right? I don't think Palmer will play that much, but it'd be nice if he does. But no, I think sort of top of A tier is great, right? Won the FA Cup as well. He was one of these old school tough defenders, you know, just absolutely, you know, if he was doing those tackles now, he'd be probably getting yellows and reds everywhere, but that was just how the game was played back then. You know, a proper old school defender, so you have to rate that, right? You have to love it. And look, played so many games for us. He's deserved of being in this top of A tier, right? Again, you could put him in S tier, but I'm trying to reserve that. Right, Super Frank. I mean, there's not even a question, right? He's the best player to play for Chelsea. I think, you know, you ask most Chelsea fans, they're all going to agree with you and say Frank Lampard is the greatest Chelsea player, best Chelsea legend, right? All-time top scorer from midfield. When you really think about it, is ridiculous. And it's not even like he was playing sort of 10 or, you know, these half winger positions. He wasn't doing any of that. He was playing box to box, you know, and sometimes even playing in a pivot. So, you know, to have that record from midfield is ridiculous as well. Won absolutely everything with us, you know, captained us alongside John Terry. And he's the player really who made me fall in love with Chelsea. You know, when I think back to my little self, when I was sort of 8 years old, watching all the games, you know, these are the players: Frank Lampard, John Terry, Petr Cech, Drogba, Ashley Cole, Essien. These are the names that resonate in my brain, right? These are the players I was watching day in, day out as a little kid, you know, an impressionable a little boy. And these are the guys who made me really, you know, follow Chelsea like I do now. So, Super Frank, obviously an S tier, and I don't think anyone's going to say anything different about that, right? So, moving on, Kerry Dixon. Again, I think another one of these players you sort of put in sort of middle of B tier. You know, definitely, you know, a Chelsea legend. Third highest goal scorer for Chelsea with 193. Loyal player, again, he's one of these, you know, who helped when we got relegated, stayed with the club, was quite loyal, and got us out of the turmoil and financial difficulties we were in at the time. So you have to say, you know, could have jumped ship, didn't. You know, third all-time scorer still with us, and definitely warrants a place in B. John Obi Mikel, I think underrated player. I'm going to put him top of C. I do quite like him. You know, over 350 appearances. I think, you know, was he world class? No, he was never one of the best midfielders in the world, but it doesn't matter. Again, he was Mr. Consistent, called upon when needed, you know, was always reliable in that respect. You know, great squad player, could fill in anywhere in midfield. And he went about his business. And you need those players in your squad. You know, you can't just have, you know, full of egos and world-class players. You need these good squad players who fight for the team, and that's what he did, certainly, right? So, C tier for me. Okay, up next, Michael Ballack. We didn't get the best out of Ballack, you know, has to be said. I think maybe sort of low C, maybe. Maybe that's a bit harsh, but I just think, you know, he was injury prone at Chelsea. We never saw Ballack that we know today, right? At his previous clubs. Yes, he won 3 FA Cups with us, which is great, you know, Premier League as well. And he was sort of pivotal in getting us to our first Champions League game in 2008, you know, which we did lose to Manchester United, which was absolutely brutal to watch. I do remember that vaguely as a little kid. You know, I probably went to bed crying that night. But, you know, he did help us get there. That was our first Champions League final as well. But he was plagued with injuries. He could never sort of shine like we knew he could. So I think he's sort of C tier is fair. And I think maybe these players are just ahead of him. Okay, Malouda. I'm going to put sort of Malouda maybe somewhat underrated as well, you have to say. You know, he had a great peak, but he couldn't maintain that level and he did quickly fall off. Got over 200 appearances for Chelsea though, so, you know, you wouldn't think it, but he did rack up a lot of games for us. I just don't think he didn't stay at that level for very long. You know, he did hit a great peak, but he couldn't maintain it. So D tier, but again, he, you know, if he was more consistent, he could have been in CB for sure. Okay. My boy Eden Hazard, he's one of my favourite players of all time, so I'm gonna put him in. I think he's below Drogba, but for me, absolutely warrants S tier. Arguably one of the greatest Premier League wingers of all time. You know, he's up there competing against, you know, Salah. For me, he's ahead of Sanchez, up there, you know, Thierry Henry, players like this. And look, let's not forget the sort of dialogue that was being said about him when he was at Chelsea and he was at his peak. People were saying he needs to leave Chelsea because if he goes elsewhere, he can win a Champions League. You know, people need to remember, not Champions League, sorry, a Ballon d'Or, right? This was the sort of caliber of player he was. And, you know, that was the dialogue. Jamie Carragher and all the pundits, right? They were saying this guy, if he went to like a Real Madrid, which obviously he did, right? But he didn't quite hit the ground running. But regardless, people were saying this guy can win a Ballon d'Or. That's how good he was, right? And look, it was just an absolute joy to watch. I feel like, you know, him and Kante, we somewhat let them down in some ways, right? Obviously, they were world-class players and some of the best players in their position of all time, for sure. But I feel like our squad building wasn't quite great. You know, you look when we won the season with Conte, right? We won the Premier League. You know, the signings we made afterwards were just bizarre, right? You know, Zappacosta. We really didn't strengthen the team, you know, like Man City and Liverpool did a couple of years later. And they were really building something reliable and a well-oiled machine. We were just like, yes, we'd have a good team for a season, and then maybe we'd let some go and we'd replace them. Our squad building just wasn't great. So you have to say towards the end of the Abramovich era, we let these players down. You know, if we weren't relying on Hazard to get a goal or an assist every big game, you know, and we had other world-class players that could fill in and do a job like that, you know, we would have won so many more Premier Leagues. But so it's a shame in that respect, but you know, carried us during poor periods. He's an all-time Premier League great, and I think for most people my age as well, Hazard's one of their favourite Chelsea players. You know, just a joy to watch. And he's like similar to Zola in that respect. Someone you'd happily pay money to go and watch play, right? So he gets S tier for me. Okay, Fernando Torres. He has to be he's in that Shevchenko territory, isn't he? You know, scored the iconic goal at the Camp Nou again, right? So, but for the price we paid, and considering what he was doing at Liverpool, you know, he did flop. He was inconsistent, injuries. He just wasn't the player we thought he was going to be, right? Same with Shevchenko. Big reputation, big money, and it just didn't work. But yes, he did get some, you know, iconic moments, scored some big goals, but overall, he's not one of the top Chelsea legends, right? Okay, Solomon Kalou. I think, again, he's sort of there with Malouda, right? These are sort of similar squad players that we had. 60 goals in about 250 appearances, so not a bad record return for someone who was a squad player. You know, was quite versatile across the front three. I just don't think he was anything more than a squad player, but definitely helped us in winning trophies, right? And then Olivier Giroud. I'm going to I'll put him at like towards the end of C tier. I think he's somewhat of an underrated player, you know, especially when you're thinking about his Chelsea career. It helped massively in us winning the Champions League, you know, some really important goals, that bicycle kick against Porto, right? And also some really important goals in the Europa League. Great professional, you know, again, one of these squad players, when called upon, did a job. Whether he was playing 20 minutes or he was starting, you know, we would get, you know, a good performance out of him. We got him towards the end of his career when he was, you know, old, but look, I think he was definitely underrated in that respect. Important goals, and we need squad players, right? We can't just have big names and big egos. So that's my list. Let me know, you know, who you agree with, who you disagree with. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of noise in the comments, but, you know, I'm quite happy with this order. Maybe some of these can be shuffled around a bit, but I think where I've put them, I've given my reasoning. So if you're still here, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and hopefully we've got some Chelsea games soon to cover. But this is my, you know, all-time sort of Chelsea rankings list, and let me know who you disagree with. So that's the video for today, boys. Peace.